But the reason I've included this is because just one view of the city has quite a variety of industrial heritage in it. So we see the windmill is the mill that gives its name to Windmill Lane, just opposite John Rogerson's Quay. And of course, behind it, we can see all the ships in the Liffey. In the distance, we can see the train coming along what was then called the Dublin Kingstown Railway towards Pearse Station. The smokestack there, the chimney stack you see is the gasworks beside Grand Canal Dock. And behind it, you can see the masts of ships in Grand Canal Dock. And just to the right of the train is the railway works for the Dublin and Kingstown Railway. So there's quite a lot in that. And that kind of epitomizes the area we're looking at here, that the Dublin Southeast area is jammed full of industrial heritage. So the book is an abbreviation. This lecture is even more of an abbreviation. It's not moving on. Oh, yeah, I got it. Sorry. The red line shows the area. So it's north of the canal. It includes the area to the east of a line from Wine Tavern Street down through Clanbrassil Street to the Grand Canal. But south of the Grand Canal is a much bigger area. It goes right over to the Grand Canal at Golden Bridge, and it includes areas like Golden Bridge, Crumlin, Harold's Cross, Terranure, Rathgar, Rathmines, and Ramla, Milltown, Clonskea, Donnybrook, Ballsbridge, Ringsend, Irish Town, and Sandymount, and Merrion. So there's a lot going on in that area. So I'll start with windmills, since we've just been looking at one. And there were, so far as I've found so far, at least 12 windmills in that area in the past, not necessarily all functioning at the same time. Now, two of them I have here marked in yellow. The one just visible at the top is the one we saw in that image a few moments ago, the one at Windmill Lane. And down at the very bottom, there's another yellow one. And the ones I've shown in yellow are the ones which we might, if you think of windmills in the Irish context, you might think of corn mills, and that's what those two were. But of course, windmills were used for a lot of other purposes, and all of the green ones in this were pumping water. Think about windmills in the Netherlands. That's what they're doing, pumping water. And so all of those are at mines where they're pumping water as the mines get deeper and the groundwater is pouring in. So that's what the predominant use of windmills was in the 19th century. And the one at the top, the one we saw in that image, was there until as late as 1971. But most of the others were gone long before that. That's the windmill at Rathgar at the quarry. And we might be always wary of looking at watercolors as to how much romanticized they are. But this one, I think, is reasonably accurate. It was done by George Victor Dunoyer, who was recording things for the Geological Survey of Ireland. And so I don't think it's romanticized, but it shows the quarry was pretty deep. This was just to the west of Orwell Road, near its junction of Zion Road. So that takes us into quarries and mines. The whole of the area we're looking at here is all on limestone, and it's Dublin Calp limestone, which has quite a high mud content in it. So a lot of it is fairly poor quality stuff, usable only for rubble. And it is used extensively through the city as for rubble building. There's a few beds of limestone here and there that are higher quality and could be worked. But if we look at the first edition Ordnance Survey map, we can see quite a lot of quarries there marked very obviously. And this is just one sample. So you see a huge number there, just to left of center at the top. This is Kimmage, and they're all limestone quarries. And you can probably see there's a windmill marked there. That's one of the ones on the previous slide. that showed how they pumped the water out. Now there, the bottom right, we can see another large quarry there. That's just to the right of Harold's Cross Road, heading down towards Terranure. And that one has a windmill and an engine, and presumably the engine was a steam engine pumping as well. But a lot of quarries all the way in the area through Dolphin's Barn and Crumlin, through the Milltown elsewhere, including Lower Baggot Street. This one is a lead mine. It's an 18th century image of a lead mine at Dolphin's Barn. So you see the mine shaft going down, and you can see adits going off, and then another shaft going down, and more adits going horizontally into the veins of lead ore. The lead mines in Dublin, obviously, as it's all limestone underneath, they're all discovered in limestone strata. And it's more than likely that they were all discovered by chance when they were quarrying for limestone. Once they find a vein of lead, then they would exploit that as well as the limestone. So there's a number of lead mines recorded in our area in the 18th and early 19th century. But that's the best illustration we have of a cut through, show how it worked. The other thing which is quarrying is brickfields. This is John Roke's map of County Dublin from 1760, with the coast over there on the right, and all through the lower part. This road here is the Merrion Road going out towards Booterstown, and all of this area here is marked as brickfields, Lord Merion's brickfields. So a lot of brick clay was being quarried there and burned to produce bricks for the building of Georgian Dublin, up until the time an Act of Parliament banned the burning of bricks within so many miles of the city because of the noxious fumes there. But we see that very well illustrated on this map. Watermills were far more common than windmills, and a huge variety of uses they were put to in our area. This, the red line is just to show our area where we're looking at, and the blue lines are, this is from Claire Sweeney's book, The Rivers of Dublin, and the blue lines show watercourses. It's not just rivers, it's other types. So you can probably see the line of the Grand Canal curving around there, broken by its bridges, and where we see the double line going north-south near the right. The wider one is the Dodder, and the narrow one is Mill Races. But quite a lot of water, and some of this was available for use for driving watermills. So the Dodder over there towards the right, towards the east, we see the Poddle here going up, and then branching off that, we see the city watercourse heading in to bring water supply into the old city basin, and that formed the main water supply for the city through up until the late 18th century, when we'll talk about that in a few moments. But certainly the Dodder, the Poddle, and the city watercourse, plus the Grand Canal, provided facilities for running watermills. As to why you don't see all those watercourses is that many of them are now underground in culverts such as this one, which that's the Poddle beneath the city. This is again John Roke's map of Dublin County, 1760, and I've coloured in the Dodder across, and in fact I've coloured in the watercourses. So you can see the thin blue lines, two of them going up to building there, and then on to a second building. So the first of those two buildings is a watermill at Rathgar on Orwell Road, and then the water goes on from there to another one which is at Dartry, at the bend where where Dartry Road turns in to go towards Rathmines. So they're just two of many watermills along the Dodder. and its tributaries, particularly the Owen Dore, which is outside our area. But these mills, one generation after another, tended to be used for different purposes. So we find a wide variety. These at this period were both used as corn mills, but the Dartry one subsequently was a brewery, it was a laundry, and laterally dye works. The one at Rathgar from the 1790s was turned into a textile mill for printing textiles, specifically calico. So you can see at that stage from the 1790s, it was massively enlarged and it was a very substantial mill works. We see in the darker blue, the watercourse coming in, the mill race, and a very long, thin mill pond, because it's actually on the side of a slope. So it had to be long and thin to get any amount of water into it on part the way up a slope. That particular works, now with many of them, the number of employees varied from time to time, depending on the prices they were getting for their textiles, the demand for them. But what we know here is that the employees here range from about 100 up to 300 in boom times. It closed in the 1840s, just after this map was published. And this the 1843 Ordnance Survey map. So it closed a year or two after that. Sometimes if you find just a view of somewhere around the city, look at it and you'll find industrial heritage hidden in it. I have to apologize to any prudes in the audience for the two naked people in this view. But that is a weir at Clonskee, and the building that's just about in the view at the very right-hand side was a paper mill. So the paper in those days was made from rags, which you put into a vat and pummeled them with hammers for a very long period until it was so broken up, it was just little bits of fiber in the water. So the water power from the river was used for driving those hammers for pulverizing the rags. We can see to that stonework in the middle, to the right of that, the weir is quite straight, and to the left of it is a bit more bendy. I'll come back to that in a moment, but in the background we can see Clonskee Bridge before it was rebuilt. It was rebuilt in 1807, so this is before that. This is a map of that mill a little bit later into the 19th century when it was in use as an iron mill. So we can see the straight bit of the weir there, and then that's the more bendy bit. That's the building. This is the flight of steps on the side that the woman was standing on. And then there is the mill back into the river down there. So that's Clonskee Road going over there towards Clonskee Bridge at the top right. Again, another view in Dublin, James Arthur O'Connor, early 19th century. This is the Dodder, and what we see in the background is Bulls Bridge in the days when it was a humpback bridge, and just behind it, a substantial factory, which was another calico printing works. This was Duffy's, and they did use water power. It's seen as early as John Rope's map of 1760s. The mill goes way back before that, but by the early 19th century, they were using steam engines to supplement the water power. One of the problems you had with rivers, even with a river the size of the Dodder, is that you can get a lot of power in the winter when there's a lot of rain, but in the drier periods in the summer, some mills could only operate for about 6 months of the year, others maybe 10 months of the year. But once steam engines became available and economically worthwhile investing in, they supplemented it with steam. But the water power would still be important because it's cheaper to run than a steam engine. So that's the Dodder at Bulls Bridge. Just downstream from that, this is Beggar's Bush Mill, which was at Lansdowne Road. So if you know the Aviva Stadium, and who doesn't, There's a row of houses directly opposite that, and this mill was on that site with the daughter at the bottom of the image there. A very picturesque mill. So moving on to the Poddle, this is first edition Ordnance Survey map from 1843, and the Poddle runs through it up there. And then we see the area at Kimmage here, which is called the Tongue. The Tongue is a prismatic shaped or triangular shaped stone in the middle that divides the water, with one route going up the city watercourse to the city basin. And both of those watercourses were used for powering mills. And there wasn't as much water as there was in the Dodder, but nonetheless, it's surprising how little water you need. One of the purposes for a mill pond is to store water overnight so you can let more of it out during the day. So it's not just the flow in the stream at any particular moment, but supplemented with water from your mill pond. So we have 3 mills in this. We've a flour mill at Larkfield at Kimmage. Down there we have a paper mill at Mount Argus, and then another flour mill up at Howell's Cross. And again, these change their uses. So if you look at one map, and then look at another map, you'll find that they're labeled as a different type of mill. Later on, some of them going to become laundries. The big one on the Poddle was the Greenmount mill near at Harold's Cross. It's right beside Mount Jerome. This one was established in the early 19th century, and the man who established the mill ran into financial difficulties, and it was acquired by his creditors, who were Pym brothers, who were merchants in the city, 3 brothers, who later developed Pym's department store in South Great Georgia Street. The Pym brothers ran it initially as it was a cotton spinning mill, and later on they extended it by adding looms, and they were weaving cotton as well, later expanding into linen and poplin. So it became a fairly large works there. And although the Pyms sold it, it was still running up until the 1960s and as a mill, but with changing hands various times. The central building in it still survives today. Much of the other structures have gone. So it's now a business park with small businesses in it here and there. In the 1860s, the Pym brothers leased out part of their site to 3 cousins who were actually happened to be relatives of the Pyms. There's a great bit of nepotism going on here. But they built the Greenmount Brewery. And the Greenmount Brewery survived only 5 years before closing down. And it was then converted into the Greenmount Distillery, which was more successful insofar as it ran for 6 years before closing down. So that advert is actually quite rare from a whiskey that was only in production for 6 years. After that, it was bought by Louis Le Brocq, who converted to an oil mill. And the Greenmount oil mill was in production well into the 20th century. So another topic we might pick up is water supply, just one of the utilities that we might look at. And I've mentioned the city water supply going in from the Poddle at Kinnage into the city basin. And that system was running from medieval times. But as the city grew in the 18th century, it became woefully inadequate. And the Dublin Corporation decided that as the Grand Canal was under construction, once it reached Dublin, they would get a supplemental water supply from there. Unfortunately, the Grand Canal Company ran into financial difficulties before they completed it, and Dublin Corporation actually bailed them out financially in order to ensure that the water supply reached the city. So that came in at James's Gate and right beside the city basin. So they were able to tap a feed from there into the city basin, which is outside the area we're discussing tonight. But it's significant in that as the city continued to grow, the corporation built another city basin at Portobello as a reservoir for that part of the city. And we might also mention Portobello Gardens next door, which had an ornamental lake in it, and that was also supplied from the Grand Canal. In the 1860s, the Dublin Corporation, of course, invested in a massive scheme for water from the Bartrey River in County Wicklow, and we don't see much of this above street level in the city, as the Bartrey works is in Wicklow. The reservoir, or the holding reservoir, is in Stillorgan. But within our area, the biggest thing you see is this pair of water mains coming in, which date from the 19th century and have the engineer's name, Park Neville, cast into the pipework. So that's at Leeson Street Bridge. Transport, well, there's masses of transport heritage in this part of the city, of course, and the port would be probably the earliest one of those. In the 18th century, this is John Roke's map of the city from 1756. And we see the amount of ships he's shown where the custom house then was on what's now Wellington Quay. And that Essex Bridge there is now where Grattan Bridge is. So that was the centre of the port at that stage. But the port was used all the way downstream as well, and ships shown on Roke's map all the way down to Poolbeg. But if we take an earlier view, this is Charles Brooking's map from 1728, and he shows the three ships there are in the channel of the Liffey. And shortly before he did this, in the second decade of the 18th century, Dublin Corporation decided to enclose substantial bodies of water on either side of the Liffey to reclaim the land for productive use. So we can see the north wall closer to us, and then Sir John Rocherson's Quay on the other side beyond the ships. And that is the line that Sir John Rogerson leased from the Dublin Corporation and reclaimed from, or built the walls to allow it to be reclaimed. Now, just to pinpoint where we are, when you walk out of this building this evening down the steps, you're walking onto the beach, because this line here, Canal Street, on the right-hand end there is Pandworth Street, and then on to Sir John Rocherson's Quay and up to and including the whole area now occupied by Grand Canal Dock. So all of that was reclaimed in the 18th century, as was the area nearer the viewer, which is outside our particular area of interest tonight. One of the biggest projects in the city in the 18th century was the Great South Wall, which commenced in the second decade of the 18th century as just a line of timber piles driven into the seabed in order to provide a sheltered anchorage for ships over here on to the left. But having done that, they decided to build a wall further out to the Pigeon House, which they did, and then they replaced the timber piles between Pigeon House and Ringsend with a wall. So this is the aerial photograph of Dublin Port, and that is the line of the Great South Wall. Most of it is not visible today because it's buried under reclaimed land, but it goes all the way from the mouth of the Dodder at Ringsend to the Poolbeg Lighthouse, a distance of about 5.2 kilometres. And the only bit you get to walk today, which is along that wall, see how much is buried. For many, many years, it was the longest sea wall in the world, and it provided a large area of safe anchorage for ships. And that's the view coming into the port, with the Poolbeg Lighthouse on the right and the one at the end of the north wall on the north bull wall. Sorry, the Poolbeg on the left, north bull wall on the right. I didn't take that photograph yesterday. I actually went through that gap yesterday, but you might remember yesterday's weather was not all that clement. And that, again, didn't take that one yesterday, but that's Poolbeg Lighthouse, which was provided for when they were building the wall and built towards the end of the 18th century. Though this is not the original lighthouse, it was rebuilt in the early 19th century. So if you look at views of it and think it looks fatter and with a viewing platform and everything, that's the original. This is the later one. It was a very important one because when they built this lighthouse, they decided to light it by candle power, which is the first one in these islands lit by candle power. Before that, they'd used coal braziers, but candles, if you had enough of them, would be brighter. And it was also one of the first then to be converted to gas, or sorry, to oil originally, which would be whale oil. In the 1790s, the early 1790s, as the Great South Wall was nearing completion, one of the problems they had, maybe if you just go back a slide or two here, you see that kink in it, is because it's built the piles, and then that bit is the stone wall, and it wasn't originally the intention to join them up. So when they did join up, they didn't, the alignment didn't quite match. So you end up with a kink. They decided to build a harbour there for the mail packets to create faster mail service, because you can get a horse with the mails down to here quicker than a ship could sail up the Liffey. And so that's why Pigeon House Harbour was built in the 1790s. The end of the 1790s, it was taken over as a barracks. But the mail ships still ran from there up until 1818, when they transferred to Hope. This is an old photograph, as you may know. I'm just trying to encourage everyone, if you haven't seen that diving bell, do go and see it. It's now raised up so that you can walk in underneath it, and it must be the smallest museum in Dublin, because it's a museum of the diving bell and what it was used for in the 19th century. So it actually has nothing to do with the southeast area, because it was for building the wall on the north side of the river. But it's here, so we celebrate it. And if you haven't been to visit it, it's well worth a visit. Won't take much of your time. There's quite a lot of elements of the port still visible, even though, of course, the quays have been beautifully resurfaced and represented for the modern day uses, which are not generally port related. But there's some remnants of port use still to be found on the quay, including bits of railway such as this. But these, of course, were never anything to do with the railway network. These were private tracks laid with permission to facilitate the loading and unloading, mainly unloading, of bulk goods from the port. And this one's on Sir John Rocherson's Quay, close to Lime Street. That shows you the kind of use. We have a coal shed there with the railway tracks going. So it would have been a horse, maybe horse-drawn, or a small steam engine to haul coal from the quay into the coal shed. So it was used obviously for bulk goods such as coal. Coal would have been the main one, but also coal was brought in on tracks like that for gasworks, which were close to the waterside. Other things along the quays that survive and have been incorporated in the landscaping are things like mooring hooks and mooring rings. And of course, there's stone steps and everything down there. So let's move away from the Liffey. We have canals. Well, we've two bits of the Grand Canal in our area. The first one is the original line of the Grand Canal, designed to go in and terminate around James's Street, which it did, finished in the 1790s after a very long, protracted construction period. But as they were getting close to completing that, it was decided actually it would be a very good idea to connect it with the port. So in 1792, they commenced the line to run through past the southern side of the city into the port. And while they were constructing that, they thought, instead of just connecting directly to the Liffey, why not provide a wet dock? So they did the Grand Canal dock up at that end. And it's worth actually pointing out that because we have a number of docks in the city, some of them have already been backfilled and out of use, but this was the first. It's almost the same period as the Custom House dock, but at the time they made to build this, they made the decision to build this, there were no wet docks in the city. A wet dock is where ships can come in the water, as opposed to a dry dock where they will pump the water out to repair a ship. So that's the Grand Canal dock, which the Grand Canal itself, which we nearly lost in the 1960s because there's a proposal to backfill it with a sewer underneath it and a road on the top of it. But just the power of public pressure, it was public outcry that led to the canal being saved. And of course, now run by Waterways Ireland, and it's a beautiful amenity to the area, as well as being industrial heritage. Where it enters the Liffey, there are 3 locks there. And the reason for the 3 is because they're different sizes. There's one big enough to take ships, one small enough to just take canal barges, and then a middle-sized one. Why would you do that? Well, if you're only going to take a canal barge through into the Liffey, you would, if you take it through the same lock as you'd bring a ship in, you're actually losing a lot of water out of the canal to do that. So for more efficient use of water, there's 3 locks, all still in place, and boats can and do come in and out of the Grand Canal dock. That's a painting showing the opening of Grand Canal dock, which is a great public occasion in 1796. So that was when the Grand Canal was completed to the Liffey. A great turnout of the public to watch it. We have railways in the area, and I'm only really going to talk about one, but I mustn't forget to mention that we have the what we tend to call the Harcourt Street line, which is now used mainly by the Lewis, and we also have the Loop line connecting with Pearse Station northwards across the river. But the very first one was the Dublin Kingstown Railway. Now, the first railway to be built anywhere in the world, and in the sense that we know railways today, was the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which opened in 1830. There were lots of railways before that, but they were used, a lot of them were horse-drawn. Most of them used bulk goods, such as coal. They were in mines. They were that kind of use, but they weren't railways that, as we think of them today. So the very first one at that time, Liverpool and Manchester, and at the time that opened in 1830, the Dublin and Kingstown was already on the drawing board, and it opened 4 years later in 1834. This is an engraving was done to celebrate the opening of the railway at that time, and we probably don't really think about it. If you catch the Dart from, say, Pearse Station out to Dún Laoghaire or somewhere, you don't really think about what you're going on. But here we can see it's well raised up above the street. So to build it, they had to build 2 massive great retaining walls and then find the amount of fill to fill in between them. And that elevated section of the railway runs out to around Lansdowne Road, then goes across to Merrion, where it goes out onto the open sea. And so they had to provide all the material to build an embankment that was not going to get washed away by the sea. Once you get to Blackrock, it's going through solid granite. And then they broke down cliffs at Monkstown to provide the platform for it. So just a very quick précis of the work needed to be done by labourers with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, horses, and carts. And they from the day they started till the day the first train ran on it was 16 months. Now, to be fair, that first train was horse-drawn with just bringing the directors, because they had to wait until all the fill there is properly settled before they carry the weight of the locomotive. So it was 20 months before the railway opened. Today, you wouldn't even have completed writing your environmental impact assessment. But I don't think today you could build it, because the environmental impact assessment would say, whoa, you're not building that railway across the Strand because of big impact on wildlife and everything else. So anyway, that's the bridge that was in that image, this Sandwich Street Bridge. And the Wide Streets Commissioners were still up and running at the time, and they demanded that separate tunnels or arches were built for pedestrians on 3 of the bridges. So that's why we have that. The Dublin Kingstown Railway Company established a railway works at what's now where Grand Canal Dock Station is. This is their railway works. They built railway carriages, they even built some locomotives there, and they maintained their rolling stock and their locomotives. And that was operational up until the 1920s, when, with the amalgamation of so many railways, the works were brought to Inchicore, and this one was closed down. Trams were a big part of the city in all the old photographs, but only from the 1870s, because the first trams were laid out as horse-drawn trams in around 1872, into the city. And then very quickly, incredibly quickly, there were tram routes and several different companies running them. This is Terenure Road East, and this is one of the last of the trams. That's one known as a luxury car. It's bigger, it's enclosed, it's more comfortable than the earlier ones. But look at the tram poling. So the cables were over the center of the road, and there were poles on alternating sides of the road, reaching out an armature to carry the cables. That's one of the disadvantages of that style of the trams. They ran down the middle of the road at 8 miles an hour. And I don't think they'd be tolerated in that kind of thing now. So if you were to do that, you'd probably do it, because passengers have to cross to the center of the road to get onto them, which is a bit disruptive of traffic. So our present day system is better. Trams, of course, needed tram depots or tram sheds, and we had no less than 10 of them in the Dublin southeast area. This is the smallest of them at Sandymount, which only used was for horse-drawn trams, so the horse-drawn trams were smaller than the later electrified ones. And so this is Dartry, which was built specifically for electric trams, and it's much bigger structure. Obviously, both of those are still there, but some of them have gone. This is the view from the walkway along the Doddard Bowes Bridge, and what you're looking at there is one of the tram depots on Shelburne Road. When electric trams were first being introduced, Dublin Corporation refused to allow them into the city. So the companies that ran outside the city were the first to electrify. And this was a route that ran from Bowes Bridge, Haddington Road and Bowes Bridge, out to Blackrock. And it amalgamated with another route to Dún Laoghaire and on to Dalkey. But then the corporation relented and allowed electrified trams in. So in the 1890s, the entire network virtually was converted to electric use. And what we have here is the original power station that powered that route from Bowes Bridge out to Dalkey. And once they amalgamated, a bigger power station was built in Ringsend Road, and this one was demolished, but it still remained a tram depot for many years after that. And the tram power station in Ringsend Road lasted until 1931, when they realised it was cheaper to take take electricity from the Ardney Crusher works by the ESB. So that's now the site of the Ringsend bus garage. Electricity, well, electricity was originally introduced for street lighting. So here we see the Corporation Electricity Works in Fleet Street, which was established in the early 1890s to light the streets. There have been quite a number of attempts to persuade the corporation to use electric lighting, and there were claims that many of the councillors on Dublin Corporation were shareholders in the gas companies, but that, of course, would never happen. And so this one works from 1893 was lighting the street lights, and that's the interior of it there, showing at left a bank of steam engines driving dynamos at right. And they were working on two different voltages because the street lights ran on one voltage and domestic power ran at another voltage. And every house or a small group of houses had a transformer to step it down. But gradually, everything got unified into the 220-volt system we have today. And the street lights came in. These were not used for trams. These were never used for gas. They are electric lights. So the taller ones in the city centre, and then the shorter ones are seen all around the suburbs, Sandymount, Ranelagh, Terranure and so forth. But still a lot of those around we looked at. As the demand for street lights and domestic light electricity grew, in 1903, a power station was built at the Pigeon House, which is this one. But that's not the original. It was actually extended and extended as everything grew. And this one, for any techies amongst you, was the first power station to use three-phase electricity. Because of its distance from the city, it needed to use three-phase. And then the old power station at Fleet Street was used as a switching station to bring it down to single-phase. It's an aerial view from the 1970s. Because of course that whole Pigeon House Pool Beg area is still used intensively today for electricity generation. And this is the generating station built in the early 1970s. Then subsequently, not long after that, built the second one with the second chimney. Those are now out of use, but there's other generating stations down there. So there's a lot of heritage. Just bridges, I want to finish on bridges. So we have a lot of variety of them. I'm not going to spend much time on Liffey bridges, but you know, all know those. Our most recent one, of course, is Rosie Hackett, which is a tram and pedestrian bridge. But we also have plenty of canal bridges, and Hewman Bridge on Upper Mount Street is the most ornate of them all because they're all named after directors of the Grand Canal Company. And Hewman paid for the extra decoration on this bridge. I think he wanted to outdo all the other directors. Some of them have been replaced as they needed wider streets, but many of them, actually, the original bridge is still there. This is Portobello, which has been widened on both sides with a cast iron parapet, which you can see the original bridge buried in underneath it. So it's well worth walking the canal towpath and having a look if you're into bridges and seeing what still survives but is unseen. Our oldest bridge is not actually ancient. We've no medieval bridges that we know of in the area, but this is 17th century bridge at Milltown. It was never publicly owned. Apparently still today is not publicly owned, but Dublin Corporation tends to quietly, or Dublin City Council, quietly refurbishes it from time to time when necessary so it doesn't fall down. But I think it was probably a toll bridge originally, and I think it was built by the mill owners for getting the flour or grain across the river to mills. Finally, Ringsend Bridge, which is one of the most stupendous and least known bridges in the city. It's just unbelievable. Don't start me on it, but we talk about elliptical bridges. but elliptical bridges are usually a semi-ellipse. This one is the full ellipse. What happened here was this is built on mud, and this is all in the estuary of the Dodder and the Liffey. And there have been bridges here over the time. In the 18th century, there were, I think, no less than 3 bridges built and collapsed here, swept away by the force of the Dodder. At the beginning of the 19th century, the architect John Semple was asked to build a bridge, and he decided that his bridge was going to last. And it has. The way he did it, because the muds are soft, and part of the problem is the subsidence or underscour, the river scouring out below the piers. What he's done, he's floated the bridge on the mud. So this is a full ellipse. You can see it turning back in underneath here. You can merge up there. So all the masonry goes under the river. And if that's not enough, if you look at it here, you can see the end of the bevel. It's not a right angle. There's a 45-degree there. And the reason for that is when the Dodder is in full flood, that helps to break down the turbulence in the river and smooth its way through so that it won't cause damage to the bridge. So it's an unbelievable piece of technology. And we go over it regularly and don't think about it, but it's well worth going down the steps beside the bridge. You can go down and have a look at it. It's well worth going at the lowest spring tides when you can see as much of the ellipse as possible. So in that very, very brief and very succinct line, I've left out so much. This is just a few of the topics we have not discussed this evening, but are mentioned in the book. But you could do probably another list as long as that of things that have not been mentioned this evening, just because it would be impossible. So I hope I've given you a good overview and a good flavour of what we've got in Dublin South East. So thank you very much.